Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. The statue of Pharaoh Khafre shows clear evidence of nose replacement. The nose is made from different stone than the rest of the statue. Ancient Egyptian statues were carved from single blocks of stone. This means the current nose was added later by someone else. Other portraits of Khafre show him with a broad African nose. The fake nose on the famous statue makes it look less African. This was done on purpose to hide his true appearance. Experts have found many statues in European museums with fake noses. The replacement noses are made from different stone that does not match the original. Historical records prove the Sphinx nose was destroyed deliberately. Muhammad Sa'im al-Daher destroyed the nose in 1378 CE. This was not an accident. It was done to damage the most famous symbol of African civilization. Early photographs from the 1800s show the Sphinx already missing its nose. This proves the damage happened long before modern times. The destruction was systematic and planned. The Inai Carlsberg Glyptotek Museum in Copenhagen keeps a collection of fake noses. These are noses that museums made to replace the original African noses on ancient statues. In the 1800s, museums commonly made new noses for statues. They wanted to make the statues look less African. In the 1900s, museums stopped this practice. They kept the fake noses in storage. The museum now displays these fake noses as evidence of past restoration crimes. This proves that museums deliberately altered African features on ancient statues. The British Museum records show they restored noses on Egyptian statues. Their own documentation admits to changing facial features during restoration work. Many statues in the British Museum have noses that do not match the original stone. The replacement noses are narrower and less African-looking than the originals would have been. The evidence shows a clear pattern. Original statues had broad African noses. These noses were deliberately destroyed or removed. Museums replaced them with narrower, non-African noses. The fake noses were made from different stone. This happened across many museums and many statues. Archaeological examination shows clear tool marks on damaged statues. These marks prove the noses were chiseled off deliberately. Natural weathering does not create these specific patterns. The tool marks are consistent across different sites and time periods. This shows organized campaigns of destruction, not random damage. Wall reliefs show the clearest evidence of deliberate targeting. Noses on flat surfaces cannot break off by accident. They must be chiseled away by hand. This type of damage appears on temple walls throughout Egypt. The precision required proves it was done on purpose to remove African features. Comparing early photographs with current conditions shows ongoing destruction. 1800s photos show more intact features. Modern photos show increased damage. The damage specifically targets African facial characteristics. Other parts of the monuments remain undamaged. Before we examine the evidence of destruction, we must first reclaim the truth about what was destroyed. Kemet, the name our ancestors gave to their land, meaning the Black Land, was an African civilization created by African people. This was not a multiracial society where various peoples contributed equally to its greatness. This was a Black African civilization, period. Our ancestors called themselves Kemtiu, the people of the Black Land. They depicted themselves consistently across 3 millennia with broad noses, full lips, and dark skin. The artistic conventions of Kemet show clear distinctions between the indigenous African population and foreign peoples, whether they were Asiatic invaders from the north or other African peoples from the south. The consistency of these depictions across thousands of years and hundreds of sites leaves no room for doubt about the racial identity of the Kemetic people. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described the Egyptians as having black skin and woolly hair. Aristotle noted that the Egyptians and Ethiopians were very black. These were not casual observations, but detailed ethnographic descriptions by people who had direct contact with our ancestors. When Europeans later encountered these same descriptions, they faced a choice: accept the African identity of Kemet or find ways to explain it away. They chose deception. The archaeological evidence supports what the ancient writers recorded. Skeletal remains from Kemetic sites show populations with distinctly African cranial features. DNA studies, when conducted honestly, reveal genetic continuity between ancient Kemetic populations and modern African peoples. The cultural practices, religious beliefs, and artistic traditions of Kemet all have their roots in African traditions that can be traced throughout the continent. Yet, European academia has spent generations trying to make Kemet anything but African. They have created fictional categories like Mediterranean race and Hamitic peoples to avoid acknowledging the simple truth that Kemet was a black African civilization. They have promoted theories about mysterious dynastic races that supposedly brought civilization to Africa from outside. They have done everything possible to disconnect Kemet from its African context, because acknowledging our ancestors' achievements would shatter the foundation of white supremacist ideology. The destruction of African features on Kemetic monuments follows patterns that can only be explained by systematic, coordinated campaigns targeting ethnic characteristics. This was not random vandalism or accidental damage. It was calculated cultural warfare designed to alter the historical record. The most damning evidence comes from the destruction of noses on flat wall reliefs throughout Kemet. Unlike three-dimensional statues, noses carved into flat stone surfaces cannot break off accidentally. They cannot be damaged by natural weathering or casual impact. Their removal requires deliberate, time-consuming work with chisels and hammers, often taking hours to complete a single face. Archaeological examination of these damaged reliefs reveals clear tool marks indicating systematic chiseling. The precision required to remove only the nose while leaving surrounding features intact demonstrates intentional targeting. This type of damage appears on temple walls, tomb decorations, and public monuments across the entire length of the Nile Valley, from Aswan to Alexandria. The pattern is unmistakable. Wherever our ancestors depicted themselves with characteristic African features, broad noses, full lips, prognathic profiles, those features have been systematically attacked. The nose, being the most prominent marker of African identity, became the primary target. But the destruction often extended to lips, which were flattened or chiseled away, and to other facial features that marked our ancestors as unmistakably African. The destruction spans the entire geographic extent of Kemetic civilization and multiple historical periods, indicating organized campaigns rather than isolated incidents. From the temples of Abu Simbel in the south to the monuments of Memphis in the north, the pattern remains consistent. African features destroyed, other elements preserved. The timing of much of this destruction coincides with periods of foreign occupation when conquering powers had clear political motivations to erase indigenous African identity. The Persian occupation, 525 to 404 BCE, marked the beginning of systematic destruction of Kemetic royal and religious monuments. The Greek Ptolemaic period, 332 to 300 BCE, saw continued alteration of monuments to emphasize Hellenic rather than African characteristics. Roman rule 30 BCE to 641 CE brought intensified destruction of pagan monuments, with particular focus on royal imagery that emphasized African identity. The Christian period, 4th to 7th centuries CE, witnessed zealous campaigns against pagan idols with systematic targeting of the faces of ancient gods and pharaohs. The Islamic conquest, 641 CE onward, continued this pattern of iconoclastic destruction. Each wave of foreign domination brought new motivations for erasing African identity from the monuments of Kemet. The Great Sphinx of Giza stands as the most famous victim of this systematic destruction. Historical records document the deliberate destruction of the Sphinx's nose by the Sufi Muslim Muhammad Sa'im al-Dar in 1378 CE. This was not accidental damage, but a calculated act of iconoclasm, targeting the most recognizable symbol of African Kemetic civilization. The Sphinx, with its distinctly African facial features, represented everything that later occupiers of Egypt sought to deny. The African genius that created the pyramids, the African wisdom that developed mathematics and medicine, the African spirituality that influenced the world's religions. By destroying its nose, they sought to rob it of its African identity and make it more palatable to non-African sensibilities. The destruction of African features on Kemetic monuments did not end with ancient iconoclasts. European archaeologists and museum curators have continued this work through more subtle but equally effective means: deliberate misinterpretation, selective documentation, and outright suppression of evidence. William Matthew Flinders Petrie, hailed as the father of scientific archaeology, was in reality the architect of scientific racism in Egyptology. Petrie's work in Egypt from the 1880s onward was guided not by objective scientific inquiry, but by a racist ideology that sought to prove European racial superiority and deny African achievements. In 1902, Petrie published a graph in the journal Man that purported to show the relationship between skull size, climate, and intelligence of different races. This pseudo-scientific diagram placed Europeans at the top of an intellectual hierarchy while relegating Africans to the bottom. Petrie used cranial measurements from skulls he had excavated in Egypt to support his racist theories, deliberately misinterpreting evidence to fit his preconceived notions about racial hierarchy. Petrie's collaboration with the eugenicist Francis Galton and statistician Carl Pearson at University College London established biometrics as a tool for promoting racial determinism. Their work provided a veneer of scientific respectability to racist theories that were used to justify European colonialism and the subjugation of African peoples. The skulls Petrie collected from Nakada were used to create statistical models that supposedly proved European intellectual superiority. But Petrie's racism went beyond theoretical frameworks. His archaeological practice was guided by the assumption that any evidence of high civilization in Egypt must have come from non-African sources. He promoted theories about dynastic races that supposedly brought civilization to Egypt from outside Africa. When confronted with clear evidence of African features on monuments, he either ignored it, misinterpreted it, or actively suppressed it. Petrie's influence on Egyptology cannot be overstated. His methods, his interpretive frameworks, and his racist assumptions became the foundation upon which the entire discipline was built. Generations of archaeologists trained in his tradition carried forward his biases, ensuring that the African identity of Kemet would be systematically denied or minimized. European and American museums housing Kemetic collections have served as the primary vehicles for perpetuating the lie that ancient Egypt was not an African civilization. These institutions have carefully curated their presentations to minimize or eliminate any suggestion that the monuments in their collections were created by Black African people. The British Museum, the Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and other major institutions have consistently presented Kemetic civilization as Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, or multicultural, anything but African. Their exhibition texts, educational materials, and scholarly publications have promoted theories that disconnect Kemet from its African context, while emphasizing supposed connections to European and Asian civilizations. These museums have also been complicit in the physical alteration of monuments. Restoration projects have often involved subtle changes to facial features, making noses narrower, lips thinner, and profiles less prognathic. These alterations are presented as conservation work, but they represent a continuation of the ancient campaign to erase African identity from Kemetic monuments, the selection of which pieces to display and how to display them also serves the agenda of African erasure. Statues and reliefs that clearly show African features are often relegated to storage or displayed without adequate context. Meanwhile, pieces that can be interpreted as showing non-African features are prominently featured and extensively documented. The European academic establishment has systematically excluded African scholars and African perspectives from Egyptological research. When African scholars like Sheikh Anta Diop presented evidence for the African identity of Kemet, they were dismissed, marginalized, or ignored by the mainstream academic community. Diop's groundbreaking work, Pre-Colonial Black Africa and the African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality, provided comprehensive evidence for the African identity of Kemetic civilization. His research included linguistic analysis, showing connections between ancient Egyptian and modern African languages, cultural analysis, demonstrating continuities between Kemetic and African traditions, and physical anthropological evidence of the African characteristics of Kemetic populations. Yet Diop's work was systematically excluded from mainstream Egyptological discourse. European and American universities refused to engage seriously with his research. Academic journals rejected papers that supported his conclusions. Conference organizers excluded African perspectives from scholarly meetings. This was not accidental oversight. It was deliberate suppression of evidence that challenged European control over the interpretation of African history. The few African scholars who managed to gain positions in European or American institutions found themselves under constant pressure to conform to Eurocentric interpretations. Those who insisted on presenting evidence for the African identity of Kemet faced professional ostracism, denial of tenure, and exclusion from research opportunities. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 marked the beginning of systematic European destruction and appropriation of Kemetic monuments. While the myth that Napoleon's soldiers used the Sphinx for target practice has been debunked, the reality of French destruction and theft is well documented. The French expedition included a team of scholars and artists whose mission was to document and appropriate Egyptian antiquities for European collections. Their work, published as the Description de l'Égypte, provided detailed documentation of monuments, but this documentation was selective and biased. Images that clearly showed African features were often altered or omitted entirely. French soldiers and scholars systematically looted temples, tombs, and monuments, shipping thousands of artifacts back to Europe. In the process, they often damaged or destroyed evidence that contradicted their preconceptions about Egyptian civilization. Inscriptions that mentioned African origins were defaced. Statues with clearly African features were accidentally damaged during transport. The French also began the practice of restoration that actually involved alteration of monuments to make them more palatable to European sensibilities. Noses were reshaped, lips were thinned, and facial angles were altered to create a more Mediterranean appearance. These changes were subtle but systematic, and they established a pattern that would be followed by subsequent European expeditions. The British Museum's Egyptian collection represents one of the largest concentrations of stolen African artifacts in the world. The acquisition of these pieces involved not just theft, but systematic alteration to obscure their African origins. Giovanni Belzoni, working for the British Museum in the early 19th century, was responsible for the removal of countless monuments from Egypt. His methods were destructive, and his motivations were purely commercial. Belzoni's agents systematically damaged monuments during removal, often targeting facial features that clearly showed African characteristics. The British Museum's own records document the alteration of pieces in their collection. Conservation reports describe the reshaping of noses, the smoothing of lips, and the alteration of facial angles. These changes were presented as necessary restoration work, but they represent a systematic campaign to erase African identity from Kemetic monuments. The museum's exhibition practices have also served to obscure the African identity of their collection. Pieces are displayed without adequate context about their African origins. Educational materials emphasize supposed connections to European and Asian civilizations, while minimizing or ignoring African connections. The overall effect is to present Kemetic civilization as anything but African. German archaeological expeditions to Egypt in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were explicitly guided by racist theories about human development and civilization. These expeditions, funded by German universities and museums, sought to prove German racial theories through archaeological evidence. The German archaeologist Georg Steindorf, working in Egypt from the 1890s onward, was a proponent of the Hamitic hypothesis, the racist theory that any achievements by African peoples must have been the result of influence from supposedly superior Hamitic peoples. Steindorf's excavations were designed to find evidence supporting this theory, and when such evidence was not found, it was often manufactured through selective interpretation or outright falsification. German expeditions systematically altered monuments to support their racial theories. Facial features were modified to appear more Semitic or Mediterranean. Inscriptions were selectively translated to emphasize supposed non-African influences. Artifacts that clearly demonstrated African origins were either ignored or reinterpreted to fit German racial theories. The influence of German archaeological work extended far beyond Germany itself. German methods and interpretations were adopted by archaeologists throughout Europe and America. The racist assumptions that guided German expeditions became embedded in the international archaeological community, ensuring that the African identity of Kemet would be systematically denied. The theory that broken noses on Kemetic statues result from ancient spiritual deactivation practices represents the latest evolution in the campaign to obscure systematic destruction of African features. This theory, promoted by museum curators like Edward Bleiberg of the Brooklyn Museum, provides a culturally neutral explanation that avoids uncomfortable questions about systematic targeting of African identity. While it is true that ancient Egyptians sometimes ritually killed statues by breaking them at joints, this practice does not explain the specific targeting of noses and other facial features. Ritual deactivation typically involved breaking statues at structurally weak points like necks, waists, and knees, not the careful chiseling away of facial features that we see throughout Kemetic monuments. The spiritual deactivation theory also fails to explain why this supposed practice was applied so selectively. If ancient Egyptians were systematically deactivating statues for spiritual reasons, we would expect to see consistent patterns of destruction across all types of monuments. Instead, we see selective targeting of facial features that specifically marked the depicted individuals as African. The promotion of this theory serves the same function as earlier academic deceptions. It provides a comfortable explanation that allows European and American institutions to avoid confronting the reality of systematic cultural destruction. By attributing the destruction to ancient religious practices, these institutions can present themselves as neutral custodians of cultural heritage, rather than accomplices in cultural genocide. Contemporary museums have refined their approach to obscuring the African identity of Kemetic civilization. Rather than making overtly racist claims, they now employ subtle techniques of presentation and interpretation that achieve the same result, disconnecting Kemet from its African context. Exhibition texts carefully avoid mentioning the African identity of Kemetic civilization. When racial or ethnic identity is discussed at all, it is presented in terms of diversity or multiculturalism that obscure the fundamental African character of the civilization. Maps and timelines are designed to emphasize connections to European and Asian civilizations while minimizing African connections. The selection and presentation of artifacts also serves this agenda. Pieces that clearly show African features are often displayed without adequate lighting or from angles that obscure these features. Meanwhile, pieces that can be interpreted as showing non-African features are prominently featured and extensively documented. Educational programs and materials continue to perpetuate Eurocentric interpretations of Kemetic civilization. School groups visiting these museums are taught that ancient Egypt was a crossroads of civilizations where various peoples contributed equally to its development. This multicultural narrative sounds progressive, but it serves to deny the fundamental African identity of Kemetic civilization. The academic publishing industry has served as a crucial tool for maintaining European control over the interpretation of Kemetic civilization. Major archaeological and historical journals have systematically excluded papers that present evidence for the African identity of Kemet while promoting work that supports Eurocentric interpretations. Peer review processes are dominated by scholars trained in Eurocentric traditions who reject work that challenges their fundamental assumptions. African scholars and scholars presenting African perspectives find their work subjected to impossible standards of proof, while work supporting Eurocentric interpretations is accepted with minimal scrutiny. The result is a body of published literature that systematically excludes African perspectives and evidence. Students and researchers consulting this literature encounter a distorted picture of Kemetic civilization that minimizes or denies its African character. This academic literature then serves as the basis for museum exhibitions, educational materials, and popular presentations of Egyptian history. Despite decades of attempts to obscure the African identity of Kemetic civilization, genetic evidence continues to confirm what our ancestors always knew. Kemet was an African civilization created by African people. Studies of ancient DNA from Kemetic mummies consistently show genetic continuity with modern African populations. The 2017 study by Schunemann et al., published in Nature Communications, analyzed DNA from 151 mummies spanning 1,300 years of Kemetic history. Despite the authors' attempts to minimize their findings, the data clearly shows genetic continuity between ancient Kemetic populations and modern African peoples. More recent studies using improved techniques have strengthened this evidence. The genetic markers found in ancient Kemetic populations are consistent with those found in modern populations throughout the Nile Valley and the broader African continent. There is no evidence for the massive population replacement that would be necessary to support theories about non-African origins of Kemetic civilization. The attempts by some researchers to interpret this genetic evidence in ways that minimize African connections represent a continuation of the academic bias that has characterized Egyptology since its inception. When genetic evidence clearly supports African origins, these researchers focus on minor non-African admixture while ignoring the overwhelming African genetic signature. The ancient Egyptian language belongs to the Afro-Asiatic language family, which originated in Africa and spread from there to other regions. Within this family, ancient Egyptian shows closest relationships to African languages, particularly those of the Nile Valley and the Horn of Africa. Sheikh Anta Diop's linguistic research demonstrated extensive connections between ancient Egyptian and modern African languages. His work showed that many basic vocabulary items, grammatical structures, and phonological features of ancient Egyptian have clear parallels in African languages. These connections are too extensive and systematic to be explained by borrowing or chance resemblance. More recent linguistic research has confirmed and extended Diop's findings. Studies by Christopher Ehret, Lionel Bender, and other linguists have traced the African origins of the Afro-Asiatic language family and demonstrated the central role of the Nile Valley in its development. This research places ancient Egyptian firmly within its African linguistic context. The attempts by some linguists to emphasize supposed connections between ancient Egyptian and Semitic languages represent another form of academic bias. While ancient Egyptian did borrow some vocabulary from Semitic languages through contact, its fundamental structure and core vocabulary are clearly African in origin. The cultural practices, religious beliefs, and artistic traditions of Kemetic civilization all have their roots in African traditions that can be traced throughout the continent. From the practice of divine kingship to the emphasis on ancestor veneration, from the use of animal symbolism to the importance of the Nile flood cycle, Kemetic culture is fundamentally African in character. The religious system of Kemet shows clear connections to African spiritual traditions. The emphasis on the afterlife, the practice of mummification, the worship of animal deities, and the concept of divine kingship all have parallels throughout African cultures. These connections are too extensive and fundamental to be explained by diffusion or borrowing. Kemetic artistic traditions also show clear African characteristics. The emphasis on frontality in sculpture, the use of hierarchical scale, the symbolic use of color, and the integration of text and image all have parallels in African artistic traditions. The distinctive style of Kemetic art developed from African roots and maintained its African character throughout its long history. The social and political organization of Kemetic civilization also reflects African patterns. The system of divine kingship, the role of women in society. The importance of extended family networks and the integration of religious and political authority all show clear connections to African social systems. The systematic denial of our African heritage in Kemet represents more than historical falsification. It is a form of psychological warfare designed to destroy African self-confidence and maintain white supremacist ideology. When our children visit museums and see the broken faces of their ancestors presented as the work of ancient tomb robbers, they internalize the message that African achievements are somehow less real, less important, less worthy of respect. This psychological damage extends far beyond individual self-esteem. It affects how African people see themselves in relation to world history in human achievements. When the greatest civilization of the ancient world is presented as non-African, it reinforces the lie that Africans have contributed nothing significant to human progress. The impact is particularly devastating for young African minds. Children who should be learning about the mathematical genius of their ancestors who built the pyramids, the medical knowledge of their ancestors who performed surgery, and the spiritual wisdom of their ancestors who developed complex religious systems, are instead taught that these achievements belong to other peoples. This mental colonization serves the interests of white supremacy by keeping African people disconnected from their own history and achievements. It makes it easier to justify continued African subordination and exploitation when Africans themselves believe they have no history of greatness. The systematic appropriation of African achievements in Kemet has created what we might call stolen legacy syndrome, the psychological condition that results from having one's cultural heritage systematically denied and appropriated by others. This syndrome manifests in various ways: self-doubt about African capabilities, internalized racism about African features and culture, and a desperate search for validation from non-African sources. When African people are taught that the civilization of their ancestors was really created by mysterious Mediterranean or Middle Eastern peoples, they begin to doubt their own capacity for greatness. When they see the broken faces of their ancestors in museums with no explanation of the systematic destruction that created this damage, they internalize negative images of African features and African identity. The cure for stolen legacy syndrome is truth. The truth about who built the pyramids, who developed hieroglyphic writing, who created the first universities, who performed the first surgeries. When African people reclaim their true history, they reclaim their dignity and their confidence in their own capabilities. The work of reclaiming our history is not an academic exercise. It is a matter of psychological and spiritual survival for African people worldwide. Every day that the lie about Kemetic civilization continues to be taught in schools and museums is another day of psychological damage to African minds. We cannot wait for European and American institutions to voluntarily correct their distortions. They have too much invested in maintaining the current narrative to change it willingly. The work of historical reclamation must be done by African people ourselves, for ourselves and our children. This means creating our own educational institutions, our own museums, our own scholarly publications. It means training our own archaeologists, historians, and educators who will present our history from our perspective. It means developing our own funding sources so that we are not dependent on institutions that have a vested interest in maintaining lies about our past. The reclamation of our Kemetic heritage requires the development of African-centered institutions that can present our history from our perspective. This means establishing museums, research centers, and educational programs that are controlled by African people and dedicated to presenting the truth about our past. These institutions must be more than just alternative voices in the academic conversation. They must become the authoritative sources for information about African history and culture. They must train the next generation of African scholars who will continue the work of historical reclamation. They must develop the resources and credibility to challenge European and American institutions directly. The technology now exists to create virtual museums and educational programs that can reach African people worldwide. We no longer need to depend on physical institutions controlled by our oppressors. We can create our own digital spaces where our history is presented accurately and our achievements are celebrated properly. The African artifacts held in European and American museums were stolen from our continent and our people. These institutions have profited enormously from displaying our heritage while denying us access to our own cultural treasures. The time has come to demand the return of these artifacts to African control. Repatriation is not just about returning objects. It is about returning control over the interpretation of our history to our people. When our artifacts are displayed in African-controlled institutions, they can be presented with proper context about their African origins and significance. We must also demand reparations for the centuries of cultural damage that has been inflicted on our people through the systematic distortion of our history. The psychological and educational damage caused by these lies has real costs that must be acknowledged and addressed. The most important work we can do is ensuring that our children learn the truth about their heritage. This means creating educational materials that present Kemetic civilization as the African achievement it was. It means training teachers who can present this material effectively. It means developing curricula that place African achievements at the center of world history rather than at the margins. We must also teach our children to be critical consumers of information about their history. They must learn to recognize the subtle and not so subtle ways that European and American institutions continue to distort African history. They must develop the analytical skills to see through academic jargon and institutional bias to the truth underneath. Most importantly, we must teach our children to be proud of their African heritage and confident in their own capabilities. When they see the broken faces of their ancestors, they must understand that this damage was inflicted by enemies who feared the power of African achievement. When they learn about the pyramids, they must know that these monuments were built by their own ancestors using African knowledge and African labor. The broken noses that stare out at us from museum walls around the world are not silent victims of time and accident. They are witnesses to one of history's most systematic campaigns of cultural destruction. They testify to the fear that our achievements inspired in our enemies. They remind us of the lengths to which white supremacist ideology will go to deny African greatness. But these broken faces also speak of resilience. Despite centuries of systematic destruction, alteration, and misrepresentation, the truth about Kemetic civilization continues to emerge. The genetic evidence, the linguistic evidence, the cultural evidence, and the archaeological evidence all point to the same conclusion. Kemet was an African civilization created by African people. The French article that prompted this response represents the latest attempt to gaslight African people into accepting comfortable lies about our history. Its promotion of the spiritual deactivation theory is just another form of the academic racism that has characterized Egyptology since its inception. We reject these lies and demand the truth. The time has come for African people worldwide to reclaim our heritage and tell our own story. We will no longer allow European and American institutions to control the narrative about our past.